Welcome back. Well, in Zimbabwe, a delegation from our governing ANC is still in that country meeting with ZANU-PF about the crisis in that country. Of course, ZANU-PF says there's no crisis in Zimbabwe, despite evidence that people are poorer. Some may not be getting enough food. Many are coming across the border, sometimes on a daily basis, just to get food for themselves and their family. Journalists and opposition activists have also been thrown into jail and in some cases denied bail for long periods of time. Professor David Moore is a professor of anthropology at the University of Johannesburg and has studied the situation in Zimbabwe, well, for about 3 decades. Professor Moore, good afternoon to you. Firstly, do you think the ANC delegation is going to be able to make a difference to the situation?
Well, it's hard to say. I guess they're still up there. They haven't been sent home yet. So that's a good sign. One usually hears the usual platitudes coming out of these meetings, but there's usually a lot more said behind closed doors. And you won't find out about that for quite a while, I suppose. I think it's interesting that now we're seeing a party-to-party meeting instead of a state-to-state meeting, so that's always a little bit more relaxed, I suppose. So we shall see.
In the end, it really boils down to whether the ANC has any influence on ZANU-PF. They're what they call each other are fraternal liberation parties, or brotherly liberation parties, but there are distinct differences between them at the same time.
Yes, and there is a sense that to make a global statement or a regional indication of solidarity, that there's usually not a lot said aloud. But I remember way back in the middle of the 2000s, what people were saying about Robert Mugabe privately, or at cocktail parties and even more, was extremely negative. It just seems to be that it's really difficult to make a public move. And whenever South Africa has tried to do that, in 2013 perhaps was the most explicit case, they got roundly condemned by the Zimbabweans. You might remember when Lindiwe Zulu said at the meeting in June 2013, before the mid-2013 election, that the roadmap wasn't ready for elections. And the day after, Mugabe told Zuma to take his street girl back, and he did. And then when the election was finished in Malawi, they all had a big joke about it. So that, in my mind, that's about the biggest effort the South Africans ever made to change the situation, and it failed. Another reason it failed was because the South Africans said to the MDC, the opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, that if they pulled out of the election, they would get support from South Africa. Well, the MDC sort of took a straw vote among its MPs, and they said, well, no, we might lose our seats. And so that thing failed. So there was also, a problem within Zimbabwe as well about uptake on some of these initiatives.
Is there also the problem that Zimbabwe can have an impact on our politics? And I remember the case, and I can't remember the year, Professor, but your knowledge of Zimbabwean politics is so encyclopedic, you might. Julius Malema was the leader of the ANC Youth League. He went to Zimbabwe. Then President Robert Mugabe praised him to the skies and seemed to almost strengthen him. And it was all about land. It was all about a very unfortunate song as well.
I didn't catch that. A very unfortunate what?
A very unfortunate song as well. It was during the Dibula Ubunu issue, the Kill the Boer issue.
Okay, yes. And apparently there was some cattle exchanged between Julius Malema and Gideon Gono, who was the Reserve Bank chairman. Yeah, those were the days when the land issue was taken up by people like Julius Malema. And one of the reasons Julius Malema got into trouble, not about Zimbabwe, but it was about Botswana, when he said South Africans should get more involved in unseating the current president there. So, yeah, that was a long time ago. And more recently, when Robert Mugabe died, after he died, Julius Malema was making overtures at the funeral, at the memorial service at the house with Grace Mugabe, and condemning or saying bad things about Mnangagwa. And then he was accused of being, with the opposition, with the internal faction in ZANU-PF, which had lost out at the coup. So, and even now, as we see Ace Magashule and Tony Ngeni in Zimbabwe. Remember a couple of weeks ago, there was a picture in the Herald of Xavier Kazukureri and Patrick Zhao, who is Robert Mugabe's nephew, at a meeting with Ace Magashule and Tony Ngeni. And the press was, the state-run press, the Herald was saying, well, why are these guys from the Generation 40 faction meeting with the ANC people? And those people are up there now. So people are making all sorts of guesses that this is a G40 project, which are the people who lost the coup, as you remember, in 2017, making deals with the ANC. And of course, the ANC is split pretty drastically as well. So there is this, and I think there was something in the past that Jacob Zuma's daughter was married to somebody in the MDC, Washman Nube. So these kind of regional politics and family politics and factional politics do spread around across the border.
From outside Zimbabwe, I mean, it can look like this is just ZANU-PF and President Emerson Mnangagwa. That's the sort of popular idea. But you're talking about internal factions. It's a lot more complicated than that. Who sort of has, hands on the levers of power apart from President Mnangagwa? Who are the other people to watch or to listen to very carefully?
Within ZANU-PF, within the two ZANU-PFs, I suppose. One sees Jonathan Moyo, who journalists around the world wouldn't like very much when he was Minister of Information, making statesman-like appearances on many webinars and producing papers about how to have a new constitutional regime. Well, he was seen as kind of the guru behind the Generation 40 faction, which was using or trying to use Grace Mugabe to keep Mugabe in power when the Lacoste faction, which was the Mnangagwa faction, the crocodile faction, was seen to be maneuvering to get into power when Mugabe was on his way out throughout the middle of this decade. So those players are to be watched. And they're old players. It's that factional battle that Mnangagwa eventually won. But Mnangagwa, of course, had to have the help of the military to come in when he returned from South Africa back in November 2017. Now, the military may not be a coherent entity anymore, if it ever was. So that's another thing to watch is Constantino Chiwenga, who's the vice president, actually plotting behind Mnangagwa's back. There are even stories about people in Mnangagwa's regional faction, Karenga, Mashingo, Gutu area, coming into some tension. A lot of it's about who has access over resources, the cabals, and so on. I think if we go back to 2008, when the crisis really was hitting, and the GNU came in, the Government of National Unity came in because Mugabe's people had killed so many MDC supporters after that election in March. At the end of 2008, before the GNU was coming in, you might recall some soldiers went out and smashed some ATMs when they realized their pay was so little, they didn't have a Christmas bonus. They started to rough up and maybe even shoot some street vendors. That was pretty close. It was planned to go much further than that. It was quelled. So if we see something like that again, the center won't hold. I think even if we go to January 2019, when we saw those demonstrations and 17 people were killed, many people raped, many people injured, it's very unclear if some people in the military were actually fomenting that those protests and where they were coming from. So it wasn't even clear back just over a year and a half ago how coherent the military forces were. And of course we have the police who which in many cases have been purged after the coup because it was the police who were behind the Generation 40, which lost the coup in the end of 2017. They were very close to Grace Mugabe. The bribes from the roadblocks were going directly up to the Commissioner of Police, up to Grace Mugabe. And there's still a lot of suspicion, a lot of mistrust of the police by the military, by Mnangagwa, and so on. So it's a very, very tense situation. And how the South Africans could move on this is very hard to say.
Okay, I mean, it's very complicated. I mean, it's certainly a lot more complicated than the sort of way that most of us understand it. You obviously understand it better. I suppose the bigger question really would be then, what would change the situation in Zimbabwe? And it would seem from what you're saying, it's really the internal dynamics of ZANU-PF and crucially the military, you know, sort of important to explain how different this is from our society where the military isn't really politicized in that way. That's really where change would come from, some kind of almost sort of fight between the factions.
Well, that's a tough question. There has been a lot of discussion in Zimbabwe about a national transitional authority. I keep thinking of the case when Lumumba was put under house arrest in the Congo and Mobutu set up a council of intellectuals to govern the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I'm not sure how national transitional authorities really work out. What would be the military role in a national transitional authority or another sort of government of national unity? Clearly, people say, let's get the military back to the barracks, but clearly you would have to have the military agreeing to some sort of transition. And indeed, it has been. In 2003, there were some military elements trying to bring Morgan Tsvangirai into some sort of intermittent regime. So
it's incredibly fascinating, Professor David Moore. I do apologize, but we have to leave it there. So much to talk about there in the situation in Zimbabwe. Professor, thank you very much indeed. Professor of Anthropology at the University of Johannesburg, but as you can see, got to be one of the world experts on the situation in Zimbabwe.